January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Thick, heavy flakes that muffled the world, turning the skeletal trees into ghosts and the frozen earth into a blank page waiting to be written in blood. The temperature hovered at 10 degrees below zero. Breath crystallized in the air. Leather boots cracked with every step. And across a narrow valley, somewhere beyond the white curtain of winter, the German infantry assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. They moved with the discipline of men who had done this 1,000 times before. Feldwebels whispered orders. Rifle bolts clicked softly as rounds were chambered. Young faces, some barely 18, stared ahead with a strange mixture of fear and fatalism that marks all soldiers on the edge of battle. But there was something else in their eyes that morning, something that had carried them through 5 years of war, through the streets of Warsaw and the steppes of Russia, through the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy. It was the cold arithmetic of experience. They had advanced before. They had broken enemy lines before. They had seen other armies crumble under the weight of German discipline and firepower. They did not know, could not know, that within the next 6 hours, that certainty would be shattered beyond recognition. The sound that would break them had not yet been heard. It waited in the darkness ahead, oiled and ready, belt-fed and merciless. It waited behind logs and frozen earth, behind the exhausted eyes of American soldiers who had been holding this line for 19 consecutive days. The Browning M1919 machine gun, 450 rounds per minute, 30 caliber, water-cooled, and in the hands of men who had learned, through desperation and necessity, how to turn it into an instrument of industrial slaughter. But first there was the calm. To understand what happened in that valley on January 17th, 1945, one must first understand what the German soldier expected to find. The Wehrmacht that advanced through the Ardennes, that winter was not the same force that had rolled across Europe in 1940. It was battered, depleted, short on fuel and ammunition, but it still carried with it the accumulated knowledge of half a decade of war. And that knowledge told them, with statistical certainty, that American infantry, when pressed, would break. They had reason to believe this. The American army that entered Europe in 1944 was largely inexperienced. Most of its soldiers had never heard a shot fired in anger before D-Day. Their training, while extensive, had been conducted in the safe environs of Georgia and Louisiana, not in the crucible of actual combat. German after-action reports from Normandy noted with clinical precision the tendency of American units to retreat when subjected to sustained artillery fire. At Omaha Beach, entire companies had pinned themselves against the seawall, paralyzed by fear. In the Bocage country, Green American divisions had been mauled by smaller German forces using terrain and experienced a devastating effect. The Germans had a phrase for it: Kindersoldaten, child soldiers. But there was another factor at play, one that ran deeper than mere inexperience. The German military mind, shaped by Clausewitz and tempered by 2 world wars, operated on the principle of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Officers were trained to seize initiative, to exploit weakness, to move with aggression and speed. The entire structure of the Wehrmacht was built around the belief that disciplined violence, properly applied, would break the will of any opponent. And for 5 years it had. They had seen the French collapse in 6 weeks. They had watched the British evacuate from Dunkirk. They had driven the Soviets back to the gates of Moscow. In every case, there came a moment, a tipping point, when enemy formations lost cohesion and began to dissolve. Soldiers dropped their weapons. Officers lost control. Units ceased to exist as fighting entities and became crowds of frightened men seeking only to escape. This was the paradigm. This was the expectation. What the German infantry did not understand, what they could not have understood without experiencing it themselves, was that the American military had undergone a transformation in the 5 months since D-Day. The green troops who had stumbled through Normandy were gone, replaced by something harder and colder. The survivors had learned. They had buried their friends in French soil and Belgian mud. They had endured German 88s and Nebelwerfer rockets. They had fought through the hedgerows and across the Siegfried Line. And somewhere in that process, they had stopped being Kindersoldaten and become something the Germans had not faced before, an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity. growing tactical competence, and the grim determination that comes from knowing you represent the only thing standing between fascism and the future. But the deeper transformation was not tactical. It was material. The Browning M1919 machine gun was not a new weapon in January 1945. It had been designed by John Moses Browning in 1919, hence the designation. It was heavy, 31 pounds without the tripod, and required a two-man crew to operate effectively. In the early days of the war, American units treated it with the same reverence European armies gave to their machine guns, a support weapon, carefully positioned, sparingly used, its ammunition rationed like gold. By the winter of 1945, that doctrine had been abandoned. American industry, once it had been fully mobilized, produced war material on a scale that defied comprehension. In 1944 alone, American factories manufactured over 2 million rifles, 500,000 machine guns, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. The logistical chain that supplied American forces in Europe was the most sophisticated ever created. Trucks rolled day and night. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys, so large they covered the ocean from horizon to horizon. Ammunition was no longer a resource to be conserved. It was a river, endless and overwhelming. And the men who manned the machine guns had learned to think in terms of that abundance. A German MG-42 crew, for all the technical superiority of their weapon, operated under constant awareness of ammunition scarcity. A belt of 250 rounds was precious. Fire discipline was absolute. Every burst was calculated, measured, justified. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, but German machine gunners rarely sustained that rate for more than a few seconds at a time. An American M1919 crew in January 1945 thought differently. They had steel ammunition boxes stacked 4 deep behind their position. They had supply sergeants who would bring more before the day was out. They had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that when the enemy appeared, they were to fire until the barrel glowed red, then fire some more. The doctrine had shifted from precision to saturation, from a weapon to be aimed to a weapon to be used. The metal belt that fed the Browning became, in the hands of these men, a symbol of something larger. It represented the industrial might of a continent untouched by war. Every 5th round was a tracer, a glowing line in the darkness that connected the trigger to the target. And behind each tracer were 4 more bullets, invisible but no less lethal. The belt itself, stamped steel, mass-produced in factories from Detroit to Denver, was a physical manifestation of American abundance. It said, "We have more. We will always have more. And we will use it all." The German attack began at 0530 hours. First came the artillery, not the massive rolling barges of earlier in the war. The Wehrmacht no longer had the shells for that, but targeted concentrations meant to suppress American positions. The sound was distinctive, a distant crump, then a rising whistle, then the world exploding in fire and frozen earth. The Americans hunched in their foxholes and waited. Some prayed, some smoked, some simply stared at nothing, their minds gone to that distant place where fear cannot follow. Then silence. In that silence, the German infantry rose from their positions and began to advance. They moved in a way they had been trained. Squad rushes covered by machine gun fire, each element supporting the next, the entire formation flowing forward with mechanical precision. The officers shouted orders. The NCOs kept the lines dressed. And the young soldiers, many of whom had joined the Army in 1944 and had learned their craft in the desperate fighting of the autumn, pushed forward through snow that came up to their knees. They expected return fire. They expected resistance. What they did not expect was the particular quality of what was waiting for them. The first Browning opened up at 200 meters. The sound was not like the MG-42's high-pitched scream. It was deeper, heavier, a mechanical roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The gunner, a 22-year-old from Pennsylvania who had been loading trucks in Pittsburgh 8 months earlier, pressed the butterfly trigger and held it down. The barrel began to heat. The water in the cooling jacket began to boil. And the belt fed smoothly, round after round, tracer and ball and armor piercing in steady rotation. The first German squad disappeared. Not retreated, not took cover. Disappeared. Men who had been advancing upright were suddenly on the ground, cut down by bullets that arrived faster than thought. The snow around them turned red, and still the gun fired. A second Browning joined from the left flank, then a third, then 6 more along a defensive line that stretched for 300 meters. The American company commander had positioned his machine guns in overlapping fields of fire, a technique learned not from any manual, but from hard experience in the Hurtgen forest. Every meter of the approach was covered by at least 2 guns. Most areas were covered by 3. The German advance, so precise in its initial movement, began to fracture. Soldiers who had been trained to move forward under fire found themselves in a situation that defied their training. The volume of fire was not something that could be endured or overcome through discipline. It was not a thing to be analyzed or flanked. It was a wall. It was a physical presence. Bullets cracked through the air so densely that the sound itself became continuous, a single sustained note of industrial violence. And it did not stop. German after-action reports, recovered years later from Wehrmacht archives, describe the experience in language that borders on the traumatic. One lieutenant, writing 3 days after the battle, noted, "The enemy machine guns did not fire in bursts. They fired in continuous streams that lasted for minutes at a time. The noise was unlike anything we had experienced on the Eastern Front. It was as if they had unlimited ammunition and no concern for barrel wear. Our casualties in the first 10 minutes exceeded 30%. Another report, this one from a battalion commander, was more direct. The Americans have changed their tactics. They no longer conserve ammunition. They use it the way we use terrain, as a resource to be exploited without regard to cost." But the most telling observation came from a Feldwebel who survived the attack. "We advanced expecting to fight soldiers. Instead, we fought machines." The psychological impact of sustained machine gun fire on attacking infantry is well documented in military literature, but the experience itself resists adequate description. To be caught in the open under such fire is to have one's sense of reality fundamentally altered. The mind, confronted with a level of violence it was not designed to process, begins to fragment. Time distorts. Some soldiers report the experience as happening in slow motion, each second stretched into an eternity. Others describe it as a blur, a confusion of noise and terror with no clear memory of sequence. What remains consistent across all accounts is a collapse of agency. The German soldier advancing through the Ardennes had been trained to believe that his actions mattered, that his skill, his courage, his discipline could affect the outcome of the battle. Under the American machine guns, that belief became impossible to sustain. There was nowhere to hide. The guns had been sighted to eliminate dead ground. There was no way to return effective fire. The sources of the shooting were protected by logs and earth. And there was no pause, no moment of reprieve in which to think or plan or coordinate response. A soldier caught in such a situation faces a choice that is not really a choice: advance into certain death or retreat into probable death. And in that moment, the carefully constructed edifice of military discipline begins to crack. The German army in 1945 was held together by many things: unit cohesion, fear of Soviet revenge, loyalty to comrades, the lingering remnants of Nazi ideology. But beneath all of these was a fundamental belief in German military superiority. The Wehrmacht had conquered Europe. Its soldiers had defeated larger armies through superior tactics and training. They believed, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that they were better at war than their opponents. The machine guns challenged that belief at its foundation. Here was an enemy that did not fight with superior tactics. They fought with superior resources. They did not maneuver with German precision. They simply pour out fire until nothing in front of them could live. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that the German military mind had refused to accept: that industrial capacity, properly applied, could overcome tactical excellence. That enough bullets, fired fast enough and long enough, would break any formation regardless of its training or morale. The symbol of this truth was not the gun itself, but the belt that fed it, that endless metal strip, clicking through the mechanism round after round, minute after minute. German soldiers who survived close encounters with American machine gun positions invariably mentioned the belts in their testimony, the way they seemed to go on forever, the mechanical rhythm of their feeding. The small piles of spent brass that accumulated beside each position, glittering in the snow like coins. One German prisoner, interviewed by American intelligence officers. Put it simply, you can kill the gunner and another takes his place. You can flank the position and there are more guns behind it. You can survive one belt, but there's always another. It does not end. That is what breaks you. Not the fear of death, but the certainty that the fire will never stop. By 0700 hours, the German attack had stalled completely. 3 companies had advanced. One had been destroyed outright. Its survivors scattered to the forest in small groups without cohesion or command. The other 2 had gone aground in whatever cover they could find, pinned by fire so intense that any movement drew immediate response. The American company that held the line had suffered 12 casualties. The Germans had suffered over 300. The disparity was not due to any particular bravery on the American side, nor cowardice on the German. It was purely a function of industrial firepower properly applied. The Americans had expended over 40,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition in 90 minutes. They had used more in that single engagement than an entire German battalion would use in a week. And when the firing finally stopped, supply trucks were already moving forward with fresh ammunition boxes. The young gunner from Pennsylvania, his hands blistered from the heat of the gun, his ears ringing from the noise, sat back against the frozen earth and lit a cigarette. He did not feel victorious. He felt numb, exhausted, the kind of tired that comes not from physical exertion but from proximity to mass death. Around him, the snow was churned to mud and marked with the detritus of battle. Spent brass, discarded belts, the smell of burned powder and hot metal. In front of his position, the German dead lay where they had fallen. Some were visible, dark shapes against white snow. Others had been covered by fresh snowfall, their presence marked only by irregular mounds. No one would collect them for another 2 days. The ground was still contested. The war continued. But something had changed. The German army that retreated from that valley carried with it a new understanding. The Americans they faced in January 1945 were not the same force that had landed in Normandy. These men did not break under pressure. They did not conserve ammunition. They operated with the confidence of soldiers who knew that every resource of their nation stood behind them, that trucks would bring more bullets, that factories would produce more guns, that the vast industrial machine of America would grind forward regardless of cost or sacrifice. And more than that, they had learned how to use it. The transformation of the American Army between June 1944 and January 1945 is one of the remarkable stories of the Second World War, yet remains curiously underexamined in popular history. We remember D-Day. We remember the Battle of the Bulge. But the process by which inexperienced divisions became battle-hardened formations capable of standing against the Wehrmacht's finest troops is less dramatic and therefore less often told. It happened in increments. Each battle taught lessons that were absorbed and transmitted. Officers who survived learned what worked and discarded what didn't. Sergeants who had seen their squads cut apart in the bocage learned how to use terrain and supporting fire. And the individual rifleman, having buried too many friends, developed the grim efficiency that marks all veteran infantry. But the material advantage mattered more than valor. The American soldier in Europe fought with the knowledge that he was backed by the most powerful industrial economy in human history. He knew that if his rifle jammed, another could be requisitioned. If his position ran low on ammunition, trucks would arrive before nightfall. If his unit took casualties, replacements would come forward within days. This knowledge did not make him braver. Courage under fire is universal, but it made him different. It gave him a kind of confidence that soldiers from resource-poor nations could not duplicate. The German soldier, by contrast, fought with the knowledge that every bullet might be his last, that if his position was overrun, no reinforcements were coming, that the weapons he carried were irreplaceable, that the tanks destroyed would not be rebuilt, that the war was being lost not on the battlefield but in the factories and rail yards far behind the lines. This asymmetry expressed itself in countless small ways. American soldiers cleaned their weapons compulsively but were not precious about them. They were tools, not treasures. German soldiers maintained their equipment with near-religious devotion, knowing it could not be replaced. Americans ate from tin cans and threw them away. Germans saved everything, reused everything, improvised constantly. Americans smoked cigarettes by the carton. Germans hoarded tobacco like gold. And in combat, this asymmetry became overwhelming. The Browning machine gun, fed by endless belts of American-made ammunition, was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, we can afford to do this. We can afford to fire until the barrel melts. We can afford to expend in 1 hour what you cannot replace in a month. And we will do it again tomorrow and the day after until you understand that this is not a war you can win through courage or skill or discipline. This is a war of production, and we have already won it. The German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously wrote that war is a continuation of politics by other means. But there is another truth, less poetic but no less profound. War is a continuation of economics by violent means. And by January 1945, the economic contest had been decided. The Allies, specifically the Americans, could produce more of everything. More planes, more tanks, more trucks, more ships, more bombs, more bullets. The Germans could not compete. They could only delay. The soldiers in that Belgian valley did not think in these terms. They thought about staying alive, about keeping warm, about getting through the next hour. But the strategic reality shaped their experience nonetheless. The Americans knew at some level that time was on their side. The Germans knew it was not. This knowledge expressed itself in the way they fought. American tactics by late 1944 had evolved toward a style that military historians would later call firepower intensive. Rather than maneuver to find enemy weak points, American units would fix the enemy in place and then destroy them with overwhelming fire. Artillery would plaster suspected positions. Air support would crater defensive lines. Machine guns would sweep approach routes. The infantry would advance only after resistance had been pulverized. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. But it worked. German tactics, by contrast, remained focused on maneuver and exploitation, infiltration, flanking attacks, night raids, the application of force at the decisive point. They fought, in other words, like an army that needed to conserve resources and rely on skill rather than mass. The problem was that by January 1945, skill was not enough. The young Feldwebel, leading his squad to the snow, had been trained by veterans of the Eastern Front. He knew how to move under fire, how to use terrain, how to coordinate with supporting elements. He was, by any measure, a competent infantry leader. But competence could not survive in the beaten zone of 6 overlapping machine guns. Skill did not matter when the volume of fire was so great that probability itself became the enemy. You could move tactically perfect and still die, because there were simply too many bullets in the air for luck to save you. The Americans, for their part, did not need to be tactically perfect. They needed to be good enough. Good enough to get the guns in position. Good enough to maintain fire discipline. Good enough to keep the belts feeding and the barrels from melting. The industrial system behind them compensated for individual shortcomings. The machine did the work, and the machine was relentless. There's a photograph taken 3 days after the battle. It shows an American machine gun position from behind, looking out over the field of advance. The gun itself is prominent in the foreground, still mounted on its tripod, barrels slightly elevated. Next to it are stacked ammunition boxes, perhaps 20 in all, some empty, some full. The snow around the position is trampled and stained. And in the distance, barely visible, are the irregular mounds that mark where the German dead still lay. The photograph was taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer as part of routine documentation. It was never published during the war. It was too graphic, too explicit in its depiction of killing. But it survived in the archives, and decades later, military historians would study it for what it revealed about the nature of that fighting. What strikes the viewer first is the sheer quantity of spent brass. It surrounds the gun position in drifts, thousands upon thousands of empty cartridge, cases catching the pale winter light. Each one represents a single round fired. Each one is a small miracle of industrial production. The brass case stamped and formed, the primer seated, the powder measured and loaded, the bullet crimped in place. Each one was manufactured in America, shipped across the Atlantic, transported by truck to a supply dump, and finally carried forward by hand to feed the gun. And each one, after firing, was discarded as worthless. This casual disposal of material would have been incomprehensible to a German soldier. Wehrmacht regulations required that spent brass be collected and returned for reprocessing. In the desperate final year of the war, German factories were remelting anything metal, church bells, statues, plumbing fixtures, to make weapons. The idea of simply throwing away thousands of brass cases would have seemed insane, but to the Americans, it was routine. They had more brass. They had more of everything. The belt itself, once empty, was often discarded as well. These were not heirloom weapons maintained across generations. They were industrial products, standardized and replaceable. The Americans fought with the confidence of men who knew that the supply chain behind them was functionally infinite, that the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were running 3 shifts a day, that the ships crossing the Atlantic were bringing more material than could possibly be used. This abundance was not accidental. It was a result of deliberate policy decisions made years earlier, when American industrial planners had looked at the coming war and understood that victory would require not just brave soldiers, but a complete mobilization of economic capacity. Factories that had made automobiles were retooled to make tanks. Plants that produced refrigerators began producing machine guns. The entire productive capacity of the continent was redirected toward a single purpose, the generation of military power. And by 1945, that system had reached full maturity. The production lines were running smoothly. The logistical networks were functioning efficiently. The army in Europe received everything it requested, and then some. Soldiers complained about many things, the cold, the food, the mail delivery, but never about ammunition. There was always more. For the Germans, this was psychologically devastating. They had begun the war as the most modern mechanized force in the world. The Blitzkrieg had been predicated on superior technology and superior doctrine. German tanks were better. German aircraft were better. German tactics were better. And for a time, these advantages had been decisive. But by 1945, those advantages had evaporated. American tanks were not better than German tanks. But America had 10 times as many. American fighters were not necessarily superior to German fighters. But the Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel, while American planes flew constant missions. And American infantry, supported by unlimited artillery and supplied with endless ammunition, could afford to fight in ways that German infantry could not. The belt feeding the Browning M1919 was, in this sense, the perfect symbol of the conflict. It represented the victory of industrial democracy over militarized autocracy. It was proof that free societies, when threatened, could mobilize resources on a scale that dictatorships could not match. It demonstrated that the future belonged not to warrior elites, but to productive economies. And it killed with mechanical efficiency. The German survivors of the January 17th attack were pulled back from the line 2 days later. Most were in shock. Some wept. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. The battalion surgeon noted in his report an unusually high incidence of what the Germans called Kriegsneuros, war neurosis. Men who had fought on the Eastern Front without breaking had been broken by 90 minutes in a Belgian forest. One soldier, a veteran of Stalingrad, tried to explain it to the doctor. In Russia, you could see the enemy. You could shoot back. Here, there was only noise and snow turning red. We might as well have been advancing into a factory machine. There was nothing to fight, only something to die against. The distinction is important. The Eastern Front had been brutal beyond measure, but it had been comprehensible within the framework of traditional warfare. 2 armies faced each other. Men fought men. Courage and skill mattered. The outcome of any given engagement was uncertain. Against the American machine guns, uncertainty disappeared. The outcome was predetermined by mathematics. X number of guns, firing Y rounds per minute, across Z meters of open ground. The equation allowed no space for human agency. Soldiers became inputs in a calculation. Their courage was irrelevant. Their training was irrelevant. Only the numbers mattered. This was a new kind of warfare, one that anticipated the mechanized slaughter of later conflicts. It was not yet the push-button warfare of the missile age, but it was moving in that direction. The human element was being progressively removed from the killing process, replaced by industrial systems that operated with mechanical logic. And the Germans, who had pioneered modern mechanized warfare, were horrified to find themselves on the receiving end of it. The The battle in the Ardennes on January 17, 1945, was not strategically significant. It did not change the outcome of the war. It was one engagement among thousands, notable only to the men who fought it and the families of those who died there. The official histories mention it in passing. If at all, no monuments mark the site. The snow that fell that day has melted and fallen again 79 times. But for the men who survived it on both sides, it marked a boundary. The American gunner from Pennsylvania returned home in 1946. He did not speak of the war often, and when he did not speak of this battle. The memories were too immediate, too visceral. The sound of gun firing without pause. The smell of hot brass and burn powder. The knowledge that he had killed men whose faces he never saw, whose names he would never know. He had done what was required. He had served. But he carried with it the particular guilt that comes from mechanized killing, the sense that he had been not a warrior but an operator, feeding ammunition into a machine that happened to kill people. The German Feldwebel, captured 3 weeks later during the final collapse, spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana. He learned English. He worked on farms. He ate food in quantities he had not seen since before the war. And he came to understand, slowly and painfully, that the machine guns in the Ardennes had been the least of it, that America's power was not just military, but civilizational, that the factories that made the bullets also made refrigerators and automobiles and radios, that the abundance he had encountered as firepower was merely the military expression of a society that operated on principles of mass production and broad prosperity. He returned to Germany in 1949, to a country divided and occupied, its cities reduced to rubble, its economy shattered, its future uncertain. And he tried to explain to his children what he had learned in that Belgian forest, that the world had changed. That war could no longer be won by courage or discipline or tactical excellence, that the future belonged to economies that could produce and to societies that could organize that production toward common purpose. They did not fully understand. How could they? They had not stood in the snow and watched precision infantry tactics dissolve under the weight of industrial fire. They had not heard the sound of the belt feeding round after round after round, that mechanical rhythm that said, "We have more, and we will use it all." In the years after the war, military theorists studied the transformation of the American Army with academic interest. Papers were written. Doctrines were updated. The lessons learned were incorporated into training programs and strategic planning. The role of firepower in modern warfare was emphasized. The importance of logistics was elevated to a matter of strategic concern. But the emotional truth of what happened in places like that Belgian valley was harder to capture in official documents. How do you quantify the psychological impact of facing an enemy that fights not with skill, but with abundance? How do you measure the effect on morale when soldiers realize that their opponents can afford to waste ammunition on a scale that makes conservation meaningless? The American way of war, as it evolved through 1944 and 1945, was predicated on a simple principle. Apply overwhelming force at every point of contact. Do not maneuver around the enemy. Destroy them where they stand. Do not conserve resources. Use them lavishly. Do not accept tactical stalemate. Break it with firepower. This approach was wasteful. It was inelegant. It lacked the tactical sophistication that European military traditions valued. But it worked. And more importantly, it worked in a way that broke enemy morale, not just physically but psychologically. To face an American machine gun position in 1945 was to confront the reality that you were fighting not just an army, but an industrial system. That behind every gun was a factory. Behind every bullet was an economy. Behind every attack was a nation that could afford to expend resources on a scale that made resistance seem futile. The belt feeding the Browning was the visible manifestation of that reality. It clicked through the gun with mechanical rhythm, round after round, minute after minute, and it said, more clearly than any propaganda, more powerfully than any speech, "We have already won. You are fighting against mathematics. The only question is how long you will continue to die before you accept it." The snow in the Ardennes eventually melted. The bodies were buried. The machine guns were cleaned, oiled, and moved forward to the next position. The war continued for another 4 months, ending with Soviet flags over the Reichstag and mushroom clouds over Japan. The American army demobilized. Soldiers returned home. The factories converted back to civilian production. But the precedent had been set. The American way of war, firepower-intensive, logistically complex, industrially supported, became the model for modern military forces. The doctrine of overwhelming force became standard. The idea that material advantage could substitute for tactical excellence became accepted wisdom, and the role of the machine gun as a symbol of industrial warfare was cemented decades later. Historians would debate whether this was progress or tragedy, whether the mechanization of killing represented an evolution in warfare or a degradation of martial values, whether courage still mattered in a world where battles were decided by production capacity rather than individual valor. But for the men who had been there, in the snow and the noise and the killing, the answer was simpler. They had survived. They had done their duty. And they had learned a truth that no amount of training could have taught. That war, in the end, is not about courage or honor or tactical brilliance. It is about who can afford to keep shooting after the other side runs out of ammunition. The German infantry had advanced calmly because they believed their training and discipline would prevail. The American machine guns spoke without mercy because they were fed by a system that could afford to fire until nothing in front of them moved. And in the space between those two certainties, the German belief in tactical superiority and the American reality of industrial abundance lay the future of warfare, brutal and mechanized and inevitable as steel. The belt fed through, the gun fired, the snow turned red, and the calm was shattered, never to return.